what I want to go over is the last thing on the review sheet. But remember, you want to make sure you double space your essay, as the directions say. There's a reason for that, as I said. It's hard to put comments in something that's single space. Plus, it's also harder to read. And bring a number 2 pencil Monday and make sure you have your Scantron form. So, the longer title of Descartes' Meditations is actually Meditations on First Philosophy. First philosophy, what that refers to are the foundational principles on which a system of philosophy is built, the most basic assumptions. And this is what Descartes is trying to do. Descartes is dissatisfied with the unsettled nature of things in philosophy. He knows that things aren't that way in mathematics. People in Descartes' day weren't going back and questioning the basic principles of Euclidean geometry, what you took as plane geometry, which were basically settled in Plato's day. And so he thinks he needs to examine his own beliefs and the beliefs generally of philosophy. He knows some false beliefs have crept in to his own thinking that need to be examined and sorted out. And what he's trying to do, though, is not just a destructive program. Descartes basically has a positive and a negative phase. In the negative phase, he's trying to clear out the underbrush, as it were, to get rid of principles that are about which he can raise doubt. And his thought is, if he can find at least one or more absolutely certain statements or principles that can function for philosophic and scientific knowledge in the way that the axioms in Euclid's system of geometry function, that is, as basic truths from which the whole rest of philosophic and scientific knowledge can be derived, what he thinks he will do is set knowledge in the sciences and philosophy on the same kind of sure footing that knowledge in mathematics is set. The 2 handouts are there if you came up. At any rate, and so the way he does this is by using a skeptical method that gets a lot of different names. I think your book calls it radical doubt, but the name used most often, and I put these on the blackboard, is methodic doubt, but it's also called methodological skepticism, or hyperbolic doubt, which underscores the unusual nature of it. And this is what you need to see. Descartes will not seem as strange to you in what he's trying to do if you realize that this is a technical program for him. In his real everyday life, I'm sure Descartes no more doubted that when he's writing his meditations, he's seated in his real living room, in a real home, by a real fire, that he really has a body with which he's holding the pen and paper that he's writing these meditations on. Again, they're not religious meditations, but philosophical meditations. But for the purposes of trying to find a certain principle, he wants to use a skeptical method of doing this. That is, he's going to try to eliminate every kind of assumption and principle about which he can raise even a way out in left field theoretical doubt. And what survives is hopefully at least one or more principles that are absolutely certain and that he can use as the starting point for rebuilding knowledge in the sciences and philosophy. So, pardon? Wait, okay. Okay, so here we are. So that's why he needs to examine his beliefs. As we said, what he thinks needs to be done to set philosophy and the sciences on a firm ground is to find one or more absolutely certain principles from which to derive them, on which to base them foundationally. So Descartes knows that this would not be a very doable program if he had to prove false beliefs that he thought might be questionable or doubtful. I mean, the whole thing might be a non-starter if he had to prove beliefs false. So he says, you know what, I really don't have to do that. The way Descartes will treat his current beliefs, following the review sheet here, is he will treat as if they are false any beliefs about which he can raise even a theoretical way out there doubt. So that's what he tries to do. And he also says this would not be a doable program if I had to sift through beliefs individually and ask, well, can I raise a doubt about this belief? What about this other belief? What about this third belief? Well, you know, how many beliefs do you have? A virtual indefinite, if not infinite, number of them. So he says, you know what, I don't need to prove them false, but the way I'm going to treat my current beliefs is as if they're false, if I can raise any kind of a doubt about it. So he also, as I said, thinks he doesn't need to go through individual beliefs, but he can treat whole classes of beliefs and raise a doubt about a whole category or class of beliefs. And it should not surprise us, since Descartes is in the rationalist tradition in philosophy going all the way back to Plato, it should not surprise you that Descartes has reservations about the reliability of knowledge we get through our five senses. Remember, for Plato, statements and what we might want to call knowledge about what our five senses tell us isn't even knowledge. It's opinion for Plato. And at best, even if it's true, like that there's a glasses case seated on that table over there, that's a true belief. But he says it's nothing but a true opinion. For Plato, knowledge is of things that are eternally true and always true, like the basic principles of math and geometry, or like what he thought were eternal moral standards, standards for justice and for what a human being is. Things that link us up with the forms. That was knowledge. But for Plato, the best we can do from the senses is opinion. Now, the way he tries to raise a doubt about what his senses tell him is he tries to take further some skeptical arguments that had already been used. In other words, in Descartes' day, people knew about optical illusions, right? The old bent ruler trick. Remember that in physics class where you took a beaker full of water, you put a ruler in it, and the ruler looks bent. Well, doggone well, it's not really bent. You can pull it right back out, and it's straight as an arrow. But because of the difference in the way light travels through water as a medium and air, it appears bent. They knew about optical illusions and ways your senses could deceive you about them. And he also knows that for distant objects or extremely small objects, our senses can deceive us. But he says there are other beliefs we have based on what our senses tell us that seem absolutely certain. Like the belief that there's a glasses case sitting on that table over there, or that there is a table in the front of the room. Descartes says, here I'm looking around my living room. How can I doubt such certain beliefs as that there's really a fireplace over there, or it's probably a stove, or that I'm really seated in my easy chair and I have a real body and real hands that are enabling me to hold the pen and paper on which I'm writing these meditations. Descartes says, how could I raise a doubt about such clear and certain knowledge? And this is where he brings in the dream conjecture. He says, well, wait a second now. Haven't I had very vivid dreams in which I thought I was doing the same thing I think I'm doing now? That is, sitting in my living room. And I awoke from the dream and realized that I wasn't in my living room. I was in bed. And I'm unclothed in bed. And so Descartes raises the $64,000 question. He says, well, if such clear dreams happened in the past, why couldn't I be dreaming now about everything that's going on around me? This is his dream conjecture. Now, one way of trying to counter this would say, well, yeah, but there are things you can do to test whether or not you're dreaming now or in a real world. Look at you, your eyes are open. If you were asleep in bed, your eyes would be closed. You can reach out and touch your hand and say, hey, this is a real hand I'm touching. This is no dream object. But then Descartes says, well, couldn't all this happen in a dream? Couldn't I be dreaming that I'm looking at myself with my eyes open? Couldn't I be dreaming that I'm touching a real hand and it's just a dream object? So he says, even though in my common sense life I'm convinced I'm in a real world and not a dream, he says, the fact that I can raise this theoretical doubt means that I have a reason to set aside as doubtful even the clearest information I get from my five senses, including information about what's going on around me immediately in the room I'm in. But this enables him to do more than just cast a doubt on his common sense beliefs about what's going on in his living room. Where Descartes is here is that this dream conjecture, the conjecture that we might be dealing with unreal dream images, and of course that was the reason for showing you the Matrix, right? These people in those pods were being fed supposedly via a computer program. A whole virtual world was being created for them in their minds. They're really in those pods hooked up to various tubes and things, but the computer program creates the matrix for them, and they think, rather than being 150 years in the future, they think they're in small town America in the 1990s, and they're getting up and they're getting their kids ready for school, and they're getting off to work, and they're going about their normal day, going to church on Sunday, doing routine things like paying their taxes. And in fact, all of it's a lie. All of it is a dream created by a supercomputer. Well, Descartes doesn't have supercomputers around in his day, doesn't have computers around, but he can conjecture about a dream. So this conjecture enables him to raise a doubt not only about ordinary common sense knowledge, but about the knowledge that we think we have from the observational sciences like physics, mathematics, astronomy. Because all these are based on observations of the senses, or observations of the senses aided by tools like microscopes and telescopes. So a whole class of beliefs is now made doubtful by this dream conjecture. Science is not made doubtful by the dream conjecture. Well, look at that whiteboard over there, or that whiteboard. They're rectangular, aren't they? In order to be a rectangle, they need to have 4 sides and 4 right angles. They do, don't they? Now, what if we were in a dream and neither one of those whiteboards is real? They're just dream images. But nonetheless, even though they're dream images, they still, even if they're a dream rectangle whiteboard, they still have to have 4 sides and 4 right angles in order to be rectangular. So Descartes says, even in a dream, even if I'm dealing with imaginary dream objects, even if I'm dealing with a dream square is still going to have 4 equal sides. There are 2 erasers sitting on that whiteboard over there. Even if those are dream erasers, and we're all dreaming, Descartes says, still, 1 eraser plus 1 eraser is going to equal 2 erasers. The basic principles of arithmetic are going to operate even if they're operating with imaginary dream objects. So he says, I can't undermine the basic principles of arithmetic using only this conjecture that I might be dreaming. Because even if the world I experience as real is just a dream world, still the basic principles of math are going to hold. So here's where he really needs to go out on a limb. But again, Descartes will seem a lot less strange to you if you understand that this is a theoretical program he's undergoing. Now, we saw that Descartes gave us the analogical argument, right? One of the things he does is give us the properties of God as God is traditionally conceived in the Judeo-Christian perspective. And Descartes' a Catholic Christian, Roman Catholic Christian. One of which is God's omnibenevolence, God's moral perfection. So Descartes says, is there any way I could call into doubt such certain knowledge as the truths of mathematics? And he says, well, I couldn't imagine God deceiving me somehow about mathematics, because that would mess up it would be at odds with the claim that God is morally good. A morally good God is not going to systematically deceive me about the beliefs of mathematics. But here again, the way to understand what Descartes is talking about here is, if you've ever made a mistake working out a math problem, right? And so you got the wrong answer. What if there were some malevolent entity, and for Descartes it can't be God, but what if there were an evil genius, an evil demon who really had it in for you and was going to whisper in your ear and screw you up every time you tried to do a math problem, so that you couldn't tell whether you had gotten the right or the wrong answer? Well, this is kind of where Descartes' going with this. He says, what if some malevolent entity were screwing me up, even in mathematics? He says, the postulation that it's at least conceivably possible that such a malevolent demon or evil genius would be out there gives me enough theoretical reason to raise a hyperbolic doubt, an extreme doubt about the veracity of even mathematical knowledge. So what is the belief that survives both conjectures? Well, here again, what he's looking for, he talks about Archimedes. Now, Archimedes, if you took physics in high school, was famous for, I guess he invented the lever, or at least he popularized it in Western thought. And Archimedes was so enamored with the ability of levers to assist us in lifting things we otherwise couldn't lift without them, that he said, you know what, in theory, if I had a long enough lever, I could get enough leverage to lift the entire Earth. But there's one other thing he needs, and that is a fixed point to rest that lever on so he can make the lever work. I drew that on the board. And so Descartes says, if I can find even one absolutely indubitable truth, a truth that is beyond any kind of doubt, that will function like my Archimedean point, a fixed point that I can rest everything else on. And that's what he's looking for. So far he hasn't found it. But he says, what if there were some evil genius out there deceiving me about every belief I have? About whether the world around me is real, about whether even the basic principles of math work. He says, what if I'm being deceived about just about everything? Descartes says, the one thing that evil demon could not do is make me doubt my own existence. That evil entity could not make me believe that I didn't exist. In other words, if I'm being deceived about everything else, The one thing I cannot doubt is that I, Descartes, am here to be deceived by this entity. So he says, I'm taking this as the first truth, my own existence. And think about bringing stuff into doubt. Descartes says, even if I'm doubting that I have a body, that the material world around me is real, even if I'm doubting the principles of mathematics, because I think there could be this evil genius out there, he says, if I'm doubting everything else, the one thing I can't doubt is that I'm here to do the doubting. So if I'm doubting everything else, I, Descartes, must exist in order to do the doubting. Now, what are doubting and being deceived? Well, they're operations of our minds. They're mental operations. So he says, I'm going to take this as my first principle, that I exist. He says the proposition I am or I exist is true and certain every time I think of it or pronounce it. Now, the way you and I have heard it even before any of us ever took a philosophy class was the way he states it elsewhere, not in the Meditations, which is cogito ergo sum in the Latin. I think, therefore I am. So Descartes says he is essentially an immaterial spirit, an immaterial mind, whose basic property is thought. And what he means by thought are going on within his mind are basic mental operations like affirming things, doubting things, willing for something to happen, willing that I raise my right arm. Perceiving things. In other words, for Descartes, the way the 20th century philosopher Gilbert Ryle stated it, for Descartes the mind is like a quasi-immaterial machine within which various mental operations take place that are like the material operations that take place in our bodies. You know, you learned in biology, we have various bodily functions, right? Elimination of waste being one of the more obvious ones, but you know, what happens when we breathe in air, circulation of blood. In other words, we've got bodily processes going on. Well, for Descartes, what is bound up with thought is that I'm an immaterial mind within which various operations, mental processes take place. So that's what he means by thinking. So Descartes says ultimately he's a thinking thing, a thinking mind that has a body, but at this point, whether he even has a body is still in doubt. I'm going to tell you later after we do the test, later next week, how he tries to get us out of this whole skepticism rut, the skeptical rut that he's gotten himself into. But what Descartes does, though, is give us some insights into the mind that take it much further than any philosopher had in the Western tradition before Descartes. But there's one belief about the mind versus the properties of matter that stems back to the ancients. One concept of the soul that Plato and Socrates dealt with, and it's a concept that if you buy into it gives you a ready-made argument for the soul's immortality. And that is that the soul is a non-composite thing. The body's composite, right? And so it can break apart. It can decay at death. But the soul was conceived to be like a mathematical point, having no extension in material space. In other words, why is it that you can fit an infinite number of points on a finite line in geometry? Anybody recall what they told you? Well, I mean, one of the properties of a mathematical point is that it has no width. And if it has no width, then in principle you can fit an infinite number of them on a line that's even an inch long. So where are we going with this? Well, when Descartes gives the properties of body of a material thing, he comes up with pretty traditional Newtonian properties that were there in the science of his day, right? The properties of a material thing are location in Newtonian space, right? There's a place that this monitor is and other places that it isn't. Occupation of space to the exclusion of other material things. You learn this stuff, like I did way back in high school physics, right? The motion, the capability of motion in space, right? Especially extension in space to the exclusion of other material things is a big property. But Cartesian minds are not extended in space, they're not located in space. This is one of the things that gives us what is called the mind-body problem. Now, we didn't go into it a lot, but I want to at least review that. If I had something written on that whiteboard over there, and I wanted to use one of those erasers to erase what was written there, we all know that if I held the eraser an inch from the whiteboard and just went, nothing would happen, right? I've got to actually contact the written stuff on the whiteboard in order to erase it. If I heated water, which I do in the morning, or tried to heat water for coffee in the morning, I use the old Melita system where you heat water separately and pour it over the filter. If I turn on the gas stove but left the tea kettle of water halfway across the room, I would not do a good job of heating water for coffee, would I? If I took out a match to strike it and light it, and I just waved it in the air instead of contacting the striker, I'm not going to be very successful. What am I getting at? Well, causes and effects have to be what the later philosopher David Hume called contiguous. They have to contact one another. The cue ball has to contact the 8 ball in order to make it move. That is, they have to be touching in Newtonian space. Now, for Descartes, minds are not located in Newtonian space. And as I said, one way of kind of grasping how you can come to a view like this is think 2 thoughts. There are 2 erasers on that whiteboard over there. Navy lost the football game last night. Now, keep both of those thoughts in your mind. Where, in relation to the thought about the 2 erasers, is the thought about Navy losing the football game last night? Is it to the left of it, to the right of it, in front of it, and back of it? You say, well, that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make a sense to say one thought is to the left or right of another thought. Well, yes. And Descartes would agree, and he'd say, well, that's just one of the things that illustrates the fact that mental operations don't take place in Newtonian space. Now, forget about the fact that my brain happens to be here rather than somewhere out there. Because remember, Descartes thinks we are a mind apart from the brain. Now, so if immaterial minds aren't even located in material space, how can they causally interact with the body? How can the mind and body interact if they're not even located in the same space? Well, now Descartes gave us an answer to this that nobody accepts. Just about nobody. There may be somebody. If there are people who still believe in a flat earth, there must be somebody who accepts Descartes' explanation of the pineal gland as the locus of interaction between mind and body. In other words, Descartes said, hey, there's this gland at the base of the brain, the pineal or pineal gland. And that's where interaction between mind and body takes place, between the immaterial mind and the material body. He says it's of such subtle matter that even the immaterial mind can move it. Yeah, but what is the pineal gland? Isn't it a material thing located in Newtonian space? In the end, Descartes has as much of a problem explaining how the immaterial Cartesian mind can move the material pineal gland as he does in explaining how the immaterial mind can move the rest of the body. In other words, his solution is no solution at all. And of course, there's no empirical evidence that that's the function of that gland, and most people nowadays would not say it is. So that's the traditional mind-body problem that even to this day is thrown in the face of anyone, including you or I, who may want to believe that they're more than just a material being, that they're in some way an immaterial mind or soul in a material body. So that's what I mean when I say the essential properties of matter are, location and extension in space. The essential property of an immaterial mind or soul is thought. And those mental operations are not thought to take place in Newtonian space. So, just real quickly, Descartes tries to convince us of the opposite of what most of us would believe. Let's say you're say a solid religious believer, and you're quite convinced that you have an immaterial soul that's going to survive the death of the body. Even if that's the case, if somebody came up to you and said, well, what are you more sure of? That you have a real material body that you can see, touch, feel, etc., or that you're an immaterial soul? Wouldn't a lot of us say, if we believe we're a dual entity, well, I'm more sure that I have a material body, but I have a strong faith that I also have an immaterial soul that'll outlast the death of the body. In other words, it's a strong item of faith for me. But Descartes is trying to convince us of the opposite. He's trying to convince us that reason gives us more reason to think that that we're an immaterial soul or spirit or mind than even that we have a material body. And he says even outside us, material objects are better known through reason than through the senses. This again underscores this emphasis of the rationalists on the special powers of our reason and their downplaying of the senses, Descartes says, take a piece of wax, heat it so it becomes pliable. Don't all the properties of it change? All the properties the senses can discern? It no longer has the texture it did. Maybe it changes color. Maybe you get a different smell from it. Descartes says all the properties in that heated wax that the senses can discern have changed, and yet we want to say that the heated wax is the same wax, the same piece of wax, as the solid, unheated piece of wax. What enables us to say that? Well, Descartes says it can't be our senses, since all those properties that the senses can detect in the wax have changed. What makes us think it's the same wax, conclude it's the same wax? Our mind, our reason. Now, I have a particular bone to pick with Descartes here. When I was a poor as dirt graduate student, sometimes to have a treat, I would make brownies from absolute scratch. I'm talking from scratch, not from mix, where you're starting off by heating 2 squares of unsweetened chocolate in a double boiler above the stove. So you take 2 pieces of baker's chocolate out, you throw them in there, and you're sitting there watching them melt. So after about 10 minutes, that chocolate is now a puddle of chocolate on the bottom of the pot, of the top pot of the double boiler. Now, Descartes would come along and say, Vic, you think that chocolate in the bottom of that double boiler is the same chocolate as those 2 pieces you took out of the box, don't you, Vic? Do you know it's not your senses that give you that knowledge? It's your reason. I say, wait a second, Descartes. I stood here and I watched them melt. You're telling me that my belief that that chocolate down there is the same chocolate doesn't come from the senses? How do you figure that? So, as I said, if this idea that reason has these powers and that the senses aren't so good as vehicles for acquiring knowledge, this is the opposite view from empiricism. This is rationalism. You and I have been trained in the opposite view, and we're going to touch on empiricism next week. We've been trained to think that the most reliable knowledge does come from the senses after we're born. So, okay. Again, bring a pencil, a pen. Also remember that Descartes, like the ancients, believed in innate ideas, knowledge we have at birth. For Plato and Socrates, that came when the soul was in the realm of the forms between incarnations. For Descartes and the Christian rationalists, we got innate knowledge at birth when God put it into our souls at birth, since they don't believe in reincarnation. So turn in your essay on time and bring a number 2 pencil, and the Scantron form. 3 things to make sure you bring. So take care. Have a good weekend, and we'll see you next time. And of course, Monday, the only thing we'll do is the Scantron part of the test. There won't be time for anything else.